How's it going, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Another edition of LandO's Logic is coming your way, as now we have got our seventh team, our seventh out of our 12 teams in total have announced their roster, have confirmed their teams moving into next season, and the newest team to do so is the Toronto Ultra. Insight, Kleenex, Scrappy, and Standy. An interesting four-man lineup, and what we'll do throughout this video is talk about, did Toronto do enough, right? Did they do enough during this offseason to be contenders, to be consistent top of the line roster, to be a consistent top of the line roster like this Toronto franchise expects? And it was an interesting offseason, right? This is the first time that the Toronto Ultra has made a roster change going into a new title. It's a very weird, it's like very strange to think about because, right, going in from the first season, MW to Cold War, they kept the same team. Methods, Cammy, Kleenex, and Bance. Then they go from Cold War into Vanguard with Insight, Cammy, Kleenex, and Bance. So this is the first time that the Toronto Ultra, during a CDL offseason, have made any move whatsoever. And in fact, it's by definition their biggest roster change that they have made since the original franchise was formed in the first place, when they were in those first few weeks of the inaugural year of the CDL, adding in multiple players at different weeks, different times, etc., etc. So it is a big change up for the Toronto franchise, but the biggest thing to keep in mind is that it was not a surprise. It is not a surprise to see the fact that two new players are on Toronto Ultra moving into next season. And you know, the biggest part of why it was an interesting offseason for them as well is not only did we expect it, but the biggest thing was that we expected it, but we didn't know who was going to be dropped. Like, how often do we have a situation where you're like, okay, I know that team is going to make a move, I have no idea who's going to be removed from that roster. Like, you just literally had no idea who Toronto was going to keep and who they were going to let go and move on to different rosters, because it really felt like any four of these players could have been removed from the team. And I mean, we talked at length throughout multiple times throughout the season, throughout our LandO's lock-in series that we did, where we basically talked about, you know, predictions every single week in the CDL. We're like, you know, okay, well, Insight's being called to be dropped this week. Kleenex is being called to be dropped this week. Now it's Bance's turn. Now it's Cammy's turn. Like, everybody had their moment in the sun, if you want to call it that. And the biggest thing for Toronto as well is that it's hard. It was hard to drop any one of them, because when you thought about one member of the Toronto Ultra, you instantly thought about the other three, given the run that they had in Cold War, being the second best team throughout the entirety of the title, winning a championship for Toronto, and then moving into Vanguard, and then having, you know, a great start to the season. At times there were peaks, but there were, you know, a decent amount of valleys throughout their run as well. And without a doubt, just in summary, one of the best rosters previously, one of the best Call of Duty rosters that we have ever seen when we think about teamwork, on-the-fly decision-making, coordination, the list goes on. Many teams, and for future sake, we will look back at this Toronto Ultra franchise, at least in regards to this four-man lineup, and think, wow, what a run it's going to be. And for the next few years as well, that's what we're going to think about when we think about the Toronto Ultra team. We're going to instantly compare that prior roster that saw loads of success to the one that we have in front of us now. But as I said, it was not a surprise. I don't think from anybody's perspective, it was not a surprise to see that they made a move, because it felt like this roster had run its course. They had that final breath, if you will, at their own Toronto major, which was amazing for them. Top 3 finish, but they just didn't have that same umph anymore that they did, especially back in Cold War. Whether that was because of the Vanguard title, whatever it was, it just felt like they weren't the same team in regards to success that they had saw the prior year. And also, too, if you're Toronto, if you are the franchise coming into this offseason and you're like, gosh, okay, we know we want to make a move. We got really close to doing so at the Pro-Am, and we have like the most coveted rookie on our bench who's hungry, who's ready to get in the game. You got to imagine it was not an easy process for Toronto throughout this whole period, considering that they've wanted to add in Scrappy for a long time. And like I said, it had to be a busy offseason for them. It was like, you know, who's going to be going in terms of who are we getting rid of? Who works best with the players that we are deciding to keep? It sounded like they were going to be adding an Afro for a while. Then he goes over to the Minnesota Rocker. It sounded like Insight maybe could have been going elsewhere, possibly to like the Atlanta FaZe and their search for the fourth now that Aristides was departing. And then, I don't know, at least from an outside perspective, it was like, okay, now that Afro's no longer an option, maybe they bring in Hixie, who's been on their bench alongside of Scrappy. Then it doesn't sound like that's actually going to occur. And then the last thing that we hear is that, okay, it could be Standy. It could be Standy, who sounded like he was going to, I don't know, teams like the Florida Mutineers. I think maybe even like LA Gorillas had been rumored. It was a few different teams for Standy. And then he finds his way onto this Toronto team. And that's what I really want to transition to now. It's a weird offseason, busy offseason, I'm sure, for Toronto, and not an easy one considering the roster that they had to move on from. But now it's a new era, right? It is a new era for this Toronto team, and it's always difficult to evaluate new rosters in Call of Duty, especially from game to game, because we have no idea. The only thing that I actually know of what players have talked about is like slide canceling. Like that's really like the only thing, is like sliding isn't as big of a factor. That's literally it. So it's very difficult to say, oh yeah, this team's going to see a lot of success this year, because you were talking about a lot of what we saw from last season. And we know, obviously, that title to title, players play differently, teams see different levels of success, et cetera, et cetera. And it maybe feels like Vanguard could have been one of those off-the-cuff titles that we think about and say, gosh, what a game that was. Like, what a different title that was in comparison to the ones that sit around it. So we will evaluate the team, but keeping things in total recognition of the fact that we have no idea truly 100% how this team is going to play moving into next year. All those things considered, when we talk about this new roster, first off, I love the Scrappy call. I mean, it's not anything surprising. It's what we expected to see happen. There's been a lot of veterans who have been in the challenger scene who have evaluated him and basically said they feel like his ability, his level of talent is going to be able to transition from game to game. From what it sounds like, it feels like the Toronto Ultra franchise, they love him, right? He was willing to move to Toronto. I heard an interesting story at one point about how a player for the Toronto team was taking a bathroom break, and Scrappy sat down in his position while they were scrimmaging, and he was like, okay, I'm gonna jump in for this guy. Let's play. What are you guys doing? Let's play the map. Like, what are we doing? Like, he was that hungry to want to play for the team. He stepped in for Toronto at one point. I forget, I think it was Insight who actually was sick. I don't know if he had COVID or if it was whatever it was. I don't remember. I actually had the cast on that. And he played excellent, led Toronto to a much needed win in the game 5, put up like a 1.18 in the series, looked great in the hard point, like a 1.29 in the hard point, a 1.3 in the S&D. Just all the way around looked like if you put him into the CDL at that moment, you knew he was not just going to be good, he was going to be great. So I really do like this decision for the Toronto Ultra. It was one that, to me, at least on paper, was probably the easiest roster change out of like any move that was made, considering that, okay, if Cammy is going to be out of the team, you do have an AR position open. It was the easiest move, I think, of this offseason in terms of who are you bringing in for a player that you're dropping. Scrappy to Toronto Ultra starting lineup. The only really question I think that you do have about Scrappy, and it is a big question, it's just about his intangibles. He seems hungry. Seems like he's got great gun skill, great talent. It's just a matter of all the extra things that it takes to be a winner. Does he have those things? Can he help be the future star for Toronto for years to come? Because I imagine they're going to want to hold on to him for as long as humanly possible. And then I guess when you just talk about the team in general, I mean, when you look at all 4 of these names on paper, there is a lot of possible upside. You know, it feels like for the Ultra, at least on social media, I've seen a lot of people say that they either love the team or they're not a big fan at all. It feels like it's one or the other. It's like, yeah, I think this team's top 4, top 5 caliber. There's a lot of other people who are saying, yeah, middle of the pack at best. I don't know. That's at least what I've been saying. I feel like for Toronto, when we talk about this team specifically, the upside aspect of it is that really the biggest issue that this team saw throughout this past season in Vanguard was the lack of slang, especially when we talked about your SMGs, when we talked about the team coordination. I mean, there were times where nobody on this roster had above a 1 KD in any game mode except for maybe like an S&D or maybe a one-off control KD or something like that. Toronto Ultra ended out this season in Vanguard number 11 in hardpoint KD overall. They finished number 11 an overall hardpoint record that sits just above the Paris Legion. At some point, Toronto had a 2-18 stretch in hardpoint. They went an entire major without winning a single hardpoint. That was Major 1, Optic Texas Major. They, in that tournament alone, I think they finished like top 4 and didn't win a single hardpoint in any of their series. It was strictly S&D and Control. Impressive, but looking at the end of the season, you could see they would never really figure out the hardpoint issues. They closed out the season finishing 1-11 in their opening hardpoints as well. And when you talk about upside as well for Toronto in terms of what they experienced last year, I feel like moving on, you do have new Slayers who are added onto your roster, right? I think that we can all agree Scrappy's going to come in and probably put up numbers. I think moving into next year, I expect Insight to be good, if not even better than he was in Vanguard. I mean, he still had a solid season when you look at statistics, and while statistics don't tell the whole story, had one of the more dominant seasons that we've seen from rookie in a while. Back in Cold War, had an outstanding year. If MW2 is more similar to that, then you've got a great Insight that you can look forward to. One of the best main ARs in the game. And then you have Scrappy, who's argued to be a rookie of the year. I mean, in terms of expectations. So you're looking at what you struggled with last year. And at least if you're talking about your ARs, you feel very good about that. I think if you're Toronto, you're like, okay, cool. We know that the ARs are going to be great. Really, the questions rely on the SMG side of things. And that's really where we get into this conversation of the possible upside. The upside is absolutely there with the ARs. Is the upside possibly there with the SMGs? Which that's what defines so many rosters. That's what defines so many teams in the CDL, is how well are your SMGs playing? How good can they be? And can they be consistent? And that very well could be the same conversation that we have for Toronto Ultra moving into this next season, because Toronto did lose someone like Bance, who had the occasional breakout map, but he was there to guide the team, make great comms, always on the flank, being impactful, setting up the rest of the squad to succeed. A lot of intangibles, a lot of things that I think that Toronto are going to have to be very aware of, is that, hey, we don't have this voice in this moment. We don't have this strategy, this player making the sacrifice, making the flank, all the extra things you're going to have to figure out. And sometimes when you drop a player like that, you have to get involved in scrimmages. You have to be in the game itself to figure out over time what we truly lost. And so you do lose that, which is very tough. At the same time, though, when you do think about Vanguard, when you do think about this past year, it did not feel like Bance and Kleenex in terms of the SMGs were working out very well, right? The numbers were down among all SMG duos, just in hardpoint specifically. They were the number 2 SMG duo in engagements per 10 minutes. Kleenex was number 1 overall by a mile on engagements per 10 minutes. So they were the number 2 fastest SMG duo, but they were the number 11th SMG duo in terms of overall damage. So they were sprinting, they were fast, they were getting in engagements, but in terms of actual damage, they were number 11. The biggest drop-off of any SMG duo, no question about it, in the CDL from this past season. It's basically, they were just behind Boston in terms of pace when they had added Vivid and Nero together, which we knew that was a unbelievably fast SMG duo. So you think about Toronto, they were like that throughout the majority of the season, just behind Boston in terms of pace, and basically just above Paris, who were ushering in SMGs throughout the season. Had John, and then you've got Jimbo, and then we bring in Johnny. I mean, a lot of different pieces in there, a lot of J's as well. So you basically had the speed of Boston, but the slang of Paris, roughly around there. And that was what you had with your Toronto SMGs. And as we know, right, those are 2 very high-class players. It just didn't feel like they were meshing well. And this is, I think that this Toronto team will really have to figure out the pace that they want to play at moving into this next title, because at least from what we saw in Vanguard, Scrappy likes to play fast. And the one series that he did play with Toronto Ultra, everybody's pace numbers were up dramatically. Cammy had like 10, 12 more engagements. Kleenex in that series had 15 to 20 more engagements than he normally does. Same thing with Bance. Everybody played faster when Scrappy was in the main AR position or in the flex position. I actually forget what role he filled in for inside. If Cammy stepped into that role or if he did, I'm not sure. But everybody played faster. I remember looking at those numbers. So you have Scrappy that plays fast. Kleenex, who is the fastest player in the league, just in general when we talk about hardpoint. And then you have Insight, who's not typically a super fast main AR. He's around like, I think 6th or 7th in terms of like engagements per 10 minutes. Then you have Standy, who a lot of people think is just unbelievably fast. He's actually not. He's one of the slower SMGs that we have in the league. And while I think he can ramp up that pace, much similar to how we did in Cold War, it's something you're going to have to figure out because you basically have one of the slower main ARs, one of the slower SMGs mixed with the fastest SMG. And then you've got Scrappy, who I think is going to be playing at a very high pace as well, because when he did, he was playing faster than everybody but Kleenex when he was on the team. So you very well could have 2 speed demons and 2 guys who just are not interested in that. And the problem is, we talk about pace, that to me is something that you're going to have to master if you are Toronto now without the veteran voice of somebody like Bance. You're going to have to figure that out now with arguably the leader gone, and maybe even too, something to think about, with maybe Marky B out of the picture as well. That's something to think about because he also has tweeted out that he is exploring his options. I think he had released that he and the Toronto franchise have basically agreed that he's going to explore options moving into this offseason. So who really knows what's going to happen with that? So to me, a lot of possible upside, but again, there are things that you're going to have to identify. And the biggest thing that could be an upside, that could be a negative moving down the line, is one player in particular, and all of the eyes, at least for me, at least in the earlier matches that Toronto has, all the eyes are going to be on Standy, right? Incredible season in Cold War as rookie. Didn't have a outstanding year when we talk about Vanguard. I mean, Minnesota didn't even make it to champs this past year. Had some moments, but overall it was about the roster change that they made because they were also struggling in hardpoint. A lot of people turned the blame, if you will, into Standy, saying, they needed a Slayer and he wasn't that same Slayer that he was the year prior. But, well, it wasn't a part 2 to Cold War for Standy, much like it wasn't for a lot of players out there. It was at least another year of experience. He did work with a few different SMG partners. Seemed like he was really starting to get along with somebody like Havoc. If we're talking about pace, for example, Kleenex is a different player than Havoc. But if Standy does want to have a slower role, which it sounded like he wanted to slow things down a little bit, let the game come to him. When we talk about Vanguard, it could be a great partner to have alongside of him. So like I said, he learned to slow down his play this past season, had a lot of things dealt on his plate. And the biggest thing for me is that Standy arguably has the most important life. If Vanguard and prior Call of Duty titles are similar to what we're going to have in MW2, his life specifically is arguably more important than maybe every other player on this team. And the reason why I say that is because he's the one who's going to be in the mix. He's going to have to be the glue for this Toronto team. If Kleenex is having great series and very low series, because like I said, not only was Bant struggling in terms of high engagements, but low damage, Kleenex was like number 1 in engagements per 10 minutes and number 61 in damage per 10 minutes. So Kleenex is there to jump in, sacrifice his life, distract the enemy. You're going to have to come in and clean up those kills. Also, like we said, from a pace perspective, how's his pace going to be? If Scrappy and Kleenex are playing at a high rate, he's going to have to match that. Because if not, you're going to have a flex running in after an SMG. That typically doesn't work, etc., etc. So at least when we talk about respawns, and I guess that's really what I'm alluding to in a lot of these conversations, his life to me on paper is going to be more important than any of these other 3 players because of what his pace, how that's going to matter. They are going to need another voice to step up. When we talk about a young roster like Toronto Ultra is, his slang levels are going to be important. Essentially every statistic is going to come under the spotlight when it comes down to this new roster moving forward. And I know I talked for a moment about the S&D side of things because we've been talking heavily about respawn. I would say like the headline, if you will, for one of these aspects about Toronto, possibly another great S&D season ahead for this Toronto franchise. Insight, number 1 in Cold War S&D KD. He was number 13th this year, but still put up a 1.10, which is great. Looked excellent with the sniper at different times throughout the season. Kleenex was number 11 in overall S&D KD this year. He was the third highest SMG when we talk about S&D KD, and Standy was the sixth highest SMG KD from this past season at a 1.05. So right now, if you're looking solely at last year of Vanguard, which is what we kind of have to do, Toronto would have, by definition, the highest SMG average KD between Standy and Kleenex. Something to consider is that none of those players did grab the bomb. That is something to definitely think about, but it's just one little fact that I wanted to throw in there. Also, don't forget, right? So not only do you have three great-looking S&D players, three of which who were very good in their respective roles from last year, but you do have somebody in Scrappy. And one thing that made Toronto Ultra NA Academy so strong at different moments was how great that they were at times in their S&D. Scrappy, who put up basically like a 1.12 to a 1.15 in basically every game mode, looked especially great in S&D a lot throughout this season. A 1.15 for Toronto NA Academy, without a doubt, I'm pretty sure their best S&D KD this season. So he also could be a standout in that game mode as well. And the last thing that I will say, we talk about the expectations of this roster, or just in general, the players that you've got on this team. It's a young roster, right? Right now, out of all the teams that have been announced, and I've actually kind of evaluated the teams that have been rumored as well, throwing those rosters in there, Toronto will most likely be the youngest team that we have in the CDL. Youngest on average player age would be the Toronto Ultra at 21.25. I know it sounds like a weird statistic, but it is what it is, right? I mean, no question about it. Toronto could have, and most likely will have, the youngest roster moving into this next season. And it's interesting because a team that we talked about almost felt like a group of veterans, even though a lot of them were young, but they played like veterans. They had that play style. Now they instantly become one of the, if not the youngest roster out there. Some leadership could be gone, right? You have Bance, who's no longer there. Cammy's no longer there. Marky B is up in the air right now. How does Toronto Ultra move forward now with these extra pieces being involved? Leadership is going to be a very, very important aspect of what really is like this Toronto team's, I don't know, like culture, if you will. I think we've talked about that a lot throughout our Roster Mania videos. Like, culture is such a big deal for this Toronto team. It was all about teamwork. It was all about doing things together. Changing that up may not be a great thing. Finding that identity is going to be a very important aspect of this roster as well. I will say the Battle of the North is going to be incredible this season. That is something that I'm very much looking forward to. If you are a Minnesota Rocker fan, if you're a Toronto fan, if in general you're just a CDL fan like I am, right? As much as I don't necessarily have like a favorite team, I always love the Battle of the North. It is a classic matchup. The fans, whenever we're in person, always get involved with it. So you have Bance and Cammy, who are off of Ultra. Now they're going to be on Minnesota. You have Standy, who was on Rocker last season. Now he's on Toronto. Afro, who was supposed to go to Toronto, he ends up with the Rocker as well. So you have a lot of moving pieces, a lot of contradictory moves being made, teams getting players that other franchise would have wanted. So Toronto versus Minnesota this season is probably going to be the best that it's ever been, would be my guess. Now, in closing, where do we rank the Toronto Ultra? Did they do enough this offseason to be a consistent contender? And as I said, it's a difficult conversation to have. It's not an easy answer to give, and I really couldn't tell you 100% like, hey guys, yes, I know for a fact this team is going to be a consistent contender this year. I'd be lying to you if I try to say that. But what I will say is, in terms of where they rank among other rosters that have been announced, the positives that I do like, a very strong S&E season ahead, I think, is there. One of the youngest rosters in the league, huge positive still. Scrappy, who I think is, at least to start off the year, going to be a Rookie of the Year frontrunner. I think he will be in that conversation, which is great. And typically, if you have an all-star rookie, at least when we look at recent seasons in the CDL, players like Simp, players like Shotzi, players like Pred, granted, SMGs versus a flex, but still, if you do have the Rookie of the Year, you're arguably going to have a lot of success. So that is something to really consider about Toronto Ultra as well. So you've got a Rookie of the Year frontrunner possibly in your midst. As I said, Standy, one of the biggest spotlights in the CDL is going to be on his level of play, but the all-out focus will be on the SMG line. That to me is what makes or breaks this team from being a top of the line roster, somebody who's in the middle of the pack, or somebody who ends up tailing off at some point throughout the season. Will be that Standy and Kleenex combo. I mean, talk about the rosters that have been announced, right? I think we have 6, not including Toronto Ultra. I mean, on paper, just given last season, I'd put LAT above them. I'd put Optic, I think, still above them, contingent on how Illy plays. I still like Seattle moving into this next year, another season where they all get to play alongside of each other. I think I like the Surge a little bit more. I still like Atlanta more because of the 3 players that you have on that team alongside of Slasher, who I think is actually a great addition. And then you have some question marks. So we're already 4 teams in. I like those 4 teams on paper more than I do like this Toronto team. And then we're talking about Minnesota and LAG. Minnesota, I think there are question marks on them, but I think I do like Rocker from a consistency perspective more than I like Toronto. And a lot of that has to do with that Afro moving piece. And then for LAG, if we're talking strictly about last season, I do like Toronto more than LAG. And so if that's where it comes down to, that would be a 6th place team or a team that's in the direct middle of the pack. And that's where I think realistically this team might be. I think there'll be times where they shift upwards where, they do have those great runs where they have that, Toronto-esque type of tournament where they're dominating in Search Destroy and they have that respawn that looks great at different moments. My biggest question is going to be on that SMG line. I think you know what you're going to get out of your ARs. You know the history of this Toronto franchise, the way they like to win. But if Marky B is out of the picture, if they're not able to find, like I said, that culture or that team identity, now that the roster has seen the biggest change that they have since the roster originally formed, since the franchise originally formed, there's going to be a lot of inward decision-making, a lot of findings that Toronto are going to have to do in order for them to be a top roster in the game. I think that the opportunity could be there, but like I said, a lot of it falls on Standy and Kleenex, in my eyes, the SMGs for this roster. So did they do enough? I think the question is up to you. I think they did do enough to be a solid team, but I do have them around that 6th, 5th, maybe spots when we talk about the power rankings moving into next year, which we will be having a power rankings episode of LandO's Logic coming out at some point in the future. But guys, feel free to let me know. What do you think about Toronto Ultra? How do you feel about this 4-man lineup moving into MW2? Do you like the offseason that Toronto did? Do you feel like they did enough? Or did you feel like maybe they just missed the mark? Maybe a few players that could have fit better with this team. Would love to continue this conversation down in the comments. But thank you guys so much for checking out this video. More off-season content to come, I promise. And we'll see you back here on the channel very soon.